All right. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Erik Kingston. I'm the Housing Resources Coordinator for Idaho Housing and Finance Association and have been working with them on fair housing issues since about 1998, representing them at the Idaho Fair Housing Forum, which is one of the many places I've met Gary Haynes, who's going to be your speaker today. And so we're going to, like I said earlier, we're going to be recording this for future reference. We'll be posting it at fairhousingforum.org, and it's going to be under the April 2021 Fair Housing Month listings, which contains lots of our trainings for the last month here. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. And we welcome feedback to make sure that I'm not messing that up. Gary, can you see my slides again?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. So again, this is the 2021 Fair Housing Webinars. This is sponsored by IHFA, Idaho Housing and Finance Association, through a grant from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And today's session is on limited English proficiency and language access planning. And we will get going here. Special thanks to Gary Haynes. I also mentioned HUD. Also special thanks to IHFA's marketing communications team and Cristina Carlos. She is on board here and she's been the one kind of behind the registration. And if you need a certificate to show that you've attended a training, she'll be the one to send that to you over email. And let's see, here's the disclaimer from HUD that we have to put on all the work products that we put out under this grant. It just says the work products are essentially our responsibility. We do vet these through HUD, and they review and approve the content, but essentially they're saying it's all on us in terms of liability. And but again, as Gary's going to mention, none of this is legal counsel that you're going to be receiving today, so keep that in mind. Okay, we're recording. Everyone's going to be muted, and if you have questions, please type them in the chat box, and Cristina and Gary and I will try to keep a close eye out on that chat box for questions and make sure we get back to you guys. Again, there's Cristina's email if you need to request a certificate of attendance. And I'm going to get started on this. So a little bit of history. I mentioned the Idaho Fair Housing Forum. This was actually started by Brian Dale, who is now the field office director for HUD in Idaho. And he hosted this for many years at HUD's office. And it was really a gathering of housing providers, advocates, property managers, cities, counties, the state government. And it was really just a chance for all of us to get together and compare when it comes to fair housing and understand where we all intersect. Our interests all overlap in fair housing. And initially, we thought about putting together a CD or a DVD with lots of documentation and guidance on limited English proficiency. And Gary Haynes was kind of spearheading that, along with Rob Christensen, who was at the Boise City-Ada County Housing Authority at the time. And in thinking about it a little bit, I thought, we should probably just put this online and make it a website or a blog, because that way it's dynamic and we can change things. And that's where this website came from, Idaho Fair Housing Forum. So we'll go back and explore that a little bit. But one of the kind of key messages that comes out of our LEP work is this idea that good customer service is welcome in any language. And you can see at the bottom of our pocket folders that we've handed out over the years. These are the words for welcome in all these different languages. And it's just, kind of an acknowledgement that everyone appreciates being treated with respect and dignity, and no matter what language they speak or what their abilities are. And that's just a good kind of rule of thumb. Here is our illustrious speaker, Gary Haynes, who's worn a lot of hats over the years, first with HUD, then with the City of Boise, and then the State Department of Commerce, and now on his own. Just a couple of other resources. This is going to be uploaded to today's training session page on fairhousingforum.org. And so you'll have access to these additional videos that you can watch. And all of them are really informative, I think, very interesting takes on fair housing. And then IHFA, under our HUD grant, we've been producing lots and lots of great outreach materials that are available to you. You can download and share these bilingual videos. We've got 4 of them on different topics. And then we have materials that are free on request. And if you just you can click on that link once you download this page and have stuff sent to you, posters, folding Z cards, bookmarks, stuff like that. So I encourage you to take advantage of that. All right, so our next, let's see, Gary and I kind of had a conversation about that, and what we're going to do next is show a brief video clip. I'm going to stop sharing for a second, and then I've got to make sure my audio is on so you can hear this. Okay, you guys can see that screen again? Are you seeing the YouTube screen, Gary?
No, I'm not.
Okay. So let's try again. How about now? It should be just a dark screen. Do you see it now?
If Christina's on, she's probably more familiar with what it might look like than there's a dark screen, but there's a bunch of other stuff up there that I'm not understanding.
Okay, so I'm gonna try this again. How about now, Cristina?
Yes.
Oh, you got it? Okay. All right, that's what we need to hear. I just want to make sure we verify that. And tell me if you can't hear it, and we'll go ahead and get it started.
The Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in housing based on race, color, sex, religion, national origin, disability, and familial status. These are referred to as protected classes. Limited English Proficiency is not a protected class under the Fair Housing Act. However, nearly all people with limited English proficiency come from other countries or have family members from non-English speaking countries. Because of that, housing decisions or policies related to English proficiency will be intertwined with issues of race and national origin, both of which are protected classes. Language-related restrictions, such as refusing to rent to someone who cannot speak English, will violate the Fair Housing Act if they are a pretext for race or national origin discrimination. Practices that may constitute discrimination under the Act include things like an advertisement that says all tenants must speak English, refusing to deal with limited English proficient tenants based on cost when the housing provider or resident can access free or low-cost language assistance, and treating people differently based on their accent. Best practice for housing providers is to allow tenants time to translate documents, allow tenants to bring along interpreters, and do not treat tenants or applicants for housing differently based on their accent or the language they speak. If you have questions about the Fair Housing Act, you can talk to an attorney for free by calling Idaho Legal Aid at 1-844-804-0386. If you have been discriminated against, you can file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development by visiting hud.gov or by calling 1-800-669-9777.
Okay. So Gary, I'm going to go ahead and launch your slides.
Okay.
And then you just say, next slide, and I'll forward them. I'll be your AV guy.
Let's see. We're on showing Idaho Fair Housing Forum at the moment.
Oh, you are? Okay. That's weird. Okay, let me get out of there and Get out of that one. How's that?
I see you is all.
Oh, sorry, technical difficulties. I blame myself. Can you see it now?
Yes, there we go.
Oh, that's all we want. It's perfection.
Perfect.
Okay.
Hey, well, the video that Erik ran for you is an Idaho Legal Aid Services video, and it covers basically the Fair Housing Act and limited English proficiency. We're going to go beyond that today. We're going to talk about 7 things you need to know about language access, and this is primarily directed at providers of assisted housing, but it also, parts of it can apply to providers of non-assisted housing as well. So last week I was in participated in a Zoom conference. Jeannie Warden, who is the acting assistant secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, was one of the presenters. And I happened to ask the question about, is it just a coincidence that some of my clients are seeing an uptick in monitoring from HUD based on language access? And her 1-sentence response was to me, it's not a coincidence. And I go, I'm thinking that's kind of the watchword that we ought to proceed with in this presentation today, is that HUD is apparently looking a little closer at language access, especially in assisted housing properties. And so what we want to do today is explore this a little bit and maybe help you by providing some information about this that would be helpful to you. So next slide, Erik. So as Erik mentioned, today we're not providing any legal advice to you, but we are providing to you what we've learned over the years of doing this work and addressing limited English proficiency, what might be considered best practices. And if you have specific questions about specific situations, probably best thing to do is to ask your attorney for help on that. Next slide. So these are the 7 areas that we're going to cover today. We're going to talk a little bit about what is limited English proficiency, why you should care. We're going to talk about meaningful access, which is key to understanding what you need to do. There's an unwritten rule that we all need to know about. We're going to talk a little bit about the connection between affirmative fair housing marketing and limited English proficiency. We'll mention some resources as we go through the presentation, and we'll also talk about the most powerful access tool that there is. Next slide. So limited English proficiency is when a person whose primary language is not English and who does not read, write, speak, or understand English very well, they're considered to be limited English proficient. Next slide. Whoops. There we go. And in the little video that we watched at the beginning, it mentioned in there that limited English proficiency is not a protected class. However, because of its relationship to race and national origin, language and limited English proficiency does become a protected class. And this is supported by some case law, as well as opinions from the HUD Office of General Counsel. So we're really dealing with, that video covered non-assisted activities, which would be essentially all housing is covered by Title 8 which is the Fair Housing Act. You're probably familiar with that. And then Title 6 covers federally assisted activities. And it basically says that you can't discriminate against a person based on certain classes, which 2 of them are race and national origin, and again, related to limited English proficiency. And you cannot discriminate against that person in accessing those federally assisted activities or services or assisted housing. Next slide. So these were some of the best practices that were talked about in the video. And I'm directing this particular comment to folks that are managers of housing that is not assisted. One of the things it didn't mention in the video was something called a limited English proficiency plan. Now, in some of the cases that I looked at where there were violations and HUD intervened and had findings against a housing provider, a provider of non-assisted housing, one of the things they almost universally required was that the housing provider adopt a limited English proficiency plan. And it just describes some of the things that were talked about in the video. But what it does is it allows a housing provider as kind of a preventive measure in their operation to adopt a limited English proficiency plan so that they can inform their property managers of what they should and should not be doing with regard to people that are limited English proficient. And the idea is to prevent a problem from happening in the first place and a violation that may be filed. Next slide. So this is one of my favorite slides. And actually, this is a new version of it that Erik provided, which I really, really like. Kind of a side-by-side in Title VI and Title VIII. Remember, Title VI involves federally assisted activities, and Title VIII involves all, virtually all housing, but also unassisted housing. So what we're looking at here is under Title VIII, which is the Fair Housing Act, the little graphic on the left-hand side, each of those kids is treated equally, but the outcomes for those kids is different. Some of them are unable to look over the fence. What we're looking for in Title VI and what the federal agencies are looking for is more what we would call, instead of equal treatment, they're also asking for equity in the outcome of that interaction that you have with a limited English proficient person. And based on that, what it is needs to happen is you need to assess that person's language needs and provide the appropriate kinds of language assistance so that that person has that equal or that equitable outcome. Next slide. So all of the federal guidance discusses meaningful access. And this happens to be a definition of meaningful access from a language assistance point of view, a meaningful access, and it's a Department of Justice definition. So I think it's important not just for me to paraphrase it, but to actually read this. And so if you want to read along with me, meaningful access is language assistance that results in accurate, timely, and effective communication at no cost to the LEP person. The access that is not significantly restricted, delayed, or inferior as compared to that of an English proficient person. So next slide. So HUD in its LEP guidance, what it begins to describe in there what meaningful access looks like. And the first thing that it really focuses on is directing managers of assisted housing to adopt a language assistance program. And there are several pieces to this. One is a language needs assessment. We'll talk more about that. A language access plan, we'll discuss that in a little more detail. Training staff, which is probably one of the areas that gets the least emphasis and is maybe one of the most important aspects of an appropriate language assistance program. So pay attention to that. And then the expectation is that a housing provider, a provider of assisted housing, will monitor for changing needs, evaluate those changes, and then update and revise the language access plan. Next slide. So we talked about the language needs assessment, and that's the first step in developing a language assistance program. It's a 4-part assessment. We look at limited English proficient persons in the market. We look at limited English proficient persons among your beneficiaries. That's HUD lingo for tenants. And those that come in contact with your program that may not be beneficiaries or tenants. And we also look at those LEP persons that come in contact with programs like your program. The four-part self-assessment also looks at the importance of the need that you're serving. And I think all of us, if we didn't understand before how important housing was, certainly during the pandemic, we've all got at least a renewed respect for the importance of housing. And it's such a basic need for all human existence. So you're dealing in an area of high need. And that means it's important to get it right. The assessment also looks at resources that are available. So HUD translates a lot of documents, provides many documents in translated form in many languages. You may have bilingual or multilingual staff that can interpret or translate. And then there's a variety of other kinds of language access tools. I've posted a bunch of them at the top of the chat with links to all of them. Hopefully you can copy that and keep that as a reference for yourself. And then part of this process is asking a housing provider to look at their budget and so forth. In other words, if to support your language assistance program, your budget has to reflect that, because language assistance can be expensive. Interpretation and translation of documents can be expensive. And so anyway, that's a major focus. It's something that as a person that does this, I don't have access to a housing provider's budget, but a housing provider has to take this information that I, as a consultant, give them and turn that budget into a document that supports that language assistance program. Next slide. So the language access plan, from that language needs assessment, we develop a language access plan. And essentially that's a policy and procedures document that you use for providing language assistance. Each project should have its own language needs assessment and its own language assistance program and its own language access plan. It explains what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, and who is responsible for doing it. Next slide. So here's some details. This isn't all of them, but these are some of the details that are addressed in the language access plan. First of all, one of the requirements in the HUD LEP guidance is that you notify people of their language access rights, that you're going to provide free interpretation to them. I wish HUD had a better document to provide for that, but in the Intermountain Fair Housing Council's language access guide, and we've provided a link to it, there is a suggested notification that can be used. USDA actually produces one that is pretty good, and it's in multiple languages. So anyway, there's some resources there, but that's a really important step, is how are you going to notify people of their rights? You need to find out, you need to have a way of determining when somebody is limited English proficient and when they need an interpreter. And then you also need to know what language that person speaks and how are you going to identify that person's language. We'll talk about some tools that are available for that. And then how are you going to access interpreters when you need them? And what if you get a caller that's limited English proficient? What are you going to do? So it also discusses things like it identifies documents that need to be translated. We'll talk about them. They're specifically called vital documents. We'll tell you what that is in a moment. The plan talks about safe harbor, and we'll talk about what safe harbor is. And then quality control. There's always quality control issues that come up around interpretation and translation. And then there is, and one of the things that we're going to touch on is marketing and affirmative fair housing marketing and the language access plan. One of the things that even the HUD guidance doesn't tell you about is designating an LEP coordinator. But in the cases that I've looked at where there have been violations of Title VI, almost uniformly, they require the housing provider to designate a person as an LEP coordinator, somebody that's where they centralize responsibility. They're watching what's going on in implementing these plans at different properties. They're watching the rate that documents are being translated and into which languages, and then making sure that those get out to property managers. So they're a coordinator of these activities around language access. Again, HUD doesn't, in the LEP guidance, doesn't require this, but in the cases that I've looked at, they do. And trying to figure out what the role of a LEP coordinator might be, we developed a template for a job description for that, and that's also on the Intermountain Fair Housing Council's website in their language access guide. So it's something, if you're interested in doing that, that's a place to go as a resource for putting together a description of what an LEP coordinator might do. Next slide. Basically, the language access plan describes the fact that there are really only two kinds of language assistance. That's interpretation and translation. And interpretation is converting one language orally into another language. And translation is the same thing, except it has to do with the text, written text, and you're converting it into an equivalent written text in another language. And it's important to understand the fact that these are different. So when you read your own language access plan, or you're reading the HUD LEP guidance, if you misunderstand these two terms, it can get confusing for you. So interpretation is oral, translation is written. Next slide. I should also mention that translation is described by translators as something you can do in your pajamas, and that's not something you can do as an interpreter. So the character of language assistance, it has three characteristics, and this is true of both interpretation and translation. It should be competent and reasonably timely, and it has to be free. And that would be paraphrasing that U.S. Department of Justice guidance that we mentioned earlier. Next slide. So when we talk about competent, this is a quality control issue, and quality control is one of those things that I think is sometimes difficult for housing providers, because this is not what we do. And but it's an issue that you need to be aware of and that you might run into. Certainly my clients have run into it. Is the quality of and the competence of that interpretation. So we often talk about the term that we're looking for is that you need at least a qualified interpreter. And that's an interpreter that understands the terminology that you're using and is conversational, is fluent in both English and the target language. Now, sometimes we talk about certified interpreters, and that's a higher level of qualification for an interpreter. And generally, we see that in the medical environment or sector and in the court system, where they do have certifications that these interpreters must carry in order to participate in those environments. And so from your standpoint, where it gets really important to think about a higher level qualification for an interpreter is when you're dealing with a situation where a person may have committed a lease violation and that person is at risk of losing their housing. So it's really important that you make sure that you have at least a qualified interpreter, and you might start moving towards that certified interpreter or an actual certified interpreter that has that level of skill to participate in that conversation and to convert what you're saying accurately into what you want your client to understand. Typically, what you would try to do if you have time is to brief your interpreter on the terminology you're going to use. We use terms of art in the work that we do as housing providers that we're accustomed to, but the normal person, even if they're English speakers, may not understand that term, and that's especially difficult for LEP persons. And translation, and the one thing here we talk about, remember, interpretation has 3 characteristics, but one of them is that it is competent. And minor children are not considered able to produce competent interpretation. And so the instruction, even in the HUD LEP guidance, is do not use children to interpret. And I would say never use children to interpret. And it's also, as I talk with people that did interpretation for their parents when they were children, it's also damaging to them. It's traumatic in some cases for these children to have that kind of responsibility put on them. So it's one of those don't do that rules especially in a federally assisted environment like we're dealing with. In translation, some ways that you can begin to have better outcomes in terms of quality control is, one, start out with the original document using what's called plain English. And you can Google that and you can find some instructions and guidance on what plain English is. The other one is what's known as the 4 eyes rule. And that is that there's an original interpreter or translator that is translating that document, and then a second interpreter that is doing a quality control review on it. This is typical of translators are typically somebody you pay to do this work. One of the things that you should ask is, how are they going to control the quality of it? And you should look for something like this 4 eyes, looking at that document. Next slide. So again, bearing on the competence of language assistance and interpretation, there is no safe harbor for interpretation. We'll talk more about what safe harbor is, but safe harbor, if somebody approaches you speaking another language and they're seeking access in some way to this assisted housing, there is no safe harbor. You have to provide that interpretation. And it's competent, timely, and free. And then translation, there happens to be safe harbor. And so not everything has to be translated into every language. And the expectation is that in your plan over time, you will, those documents where you do have to comply with safe harbor, and we'll talk about the safe harbor thresholds here in a moment, where you're hitting one of those safe harbors, you will want to translate certain documents into certain languages based on those thresholds. So let's talk about those thresholds. That's next slide, Erik, I think. Yeah. So this, in the published LEP guidance from HUD, this is what they call the safe harbor guidance. And it only addresses written language assistance. Remember, interpretation, there's no safe harbor for it. And there's a couple of things that I want to point out in this. I could spend a half an hour on this table and we'd still all be confused about it. Unfortunately, the way it's written in all of the federal guidance, including the HUD federal guidance, is a little bit of a word salad, and it's kind of hard to sort out. But the thing to know about is that if you have 1,000 people in your market area that are limited English speaking, limited English proficient persons, and they're speaking a language, and they're probably eligible for your project, then you need to translate your marketing documents, for example. There's another provision there, and you'll see it on the right-hand side under the recommended provision of written assistance, and it talks about something called a translated written notice of right to receive free oral interpretation of documents. Shortening that to offer to interpret, HUD in its guidance doesn't explain what that is. So when I worked for the city of Boise, one of the attorneys there developed some language, and it simply says, and you can, it simply says, this is an important document. In other words, don't throw it away. This is an important document. Do you need an interpreter? We will provide an interpreter for you at no cost. So it's a very simple document. Now, that particular, and you can see there's a certain threshold described on the left-hand side there where that document is required. The nice thing about that document, it's available now in something like 47 languages, I believe, on the Intermountain Fair Housing Council's website. You can place that offer to interpret with untranslated vital documents. And if you're mailing those documents to somebody, you can provide that offer to interpret with them so they don't throw it away. They know it's important. And they also know that you will provide interpretation of that document because you do not have it translated yet. So those are just a couple of things I wanted to point out. There's a lot of other nuance in this that we get lost in today. Next slide. So we talked about safe harbor and what is that? And it only bears on written language assistance, and it only bears on the translation of vital documents. And so safe harbor says for HUD, if HUD is reviewing your language assistance program and how you're carrying it out, if you're conforming to the safe harbor rules that HUD has set forth in terms of translation anyway, then you're performing adequately and you're not violating Title VI. In other words, you're compliant. The important thing to understand about safe harbor, from my standpoint, is that it's a minimum performance level. And it may not be best practice, and it may not meet your customer service needs or your customer service goals that you have for your organization. And this is particularly true as it bears on language assistance, written language assistance for your tenants. So anyway, I just suggest that think of safe harbor as a minimum performance level. If you can, you want to try to do more than that, especially as when it comes to your own tenants, your own beneficiaries of the program. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit about internet translation apps. And this is not what we call it, but this is what HUD called it in a case that I looked at back in Massachusetts. Internet translation apps are things like Google Translate. And while they're really a powerful tool, they are not a good tool to use necessarily in the environment of a federally assisted housing project. And this is why. Even Google says that they're not producing accurate, they acknowledge that it's not producing accurate translation or interpretations of language. And that's a requirement, remember. And the other thing is, remember, it's not confidential. All of these transactions that are happening on Google Translate go back to people at Google. They review it and they modify their algorithms that support Google Translate. So people are looking at these conversations, and sometimes you're having conversations with your clients that can be pretty sensitive. But they can be used, even according to HUD, and this case in Massachusetts that involved those 4 housing authorities that I mentioned. They said that they can be used for kind of the simplest kinds of communication, like we provide housing, park your car here, When can we meet? Those sort of things. And the other thing that it ignores, I think, often is that Google Translate can be a powerful tool for social exchanges that you might have with a client. And there's no requirement, because that person has nothing to do with accessing your program or service. You can use Google Translate to have that conversation with that person, to talk about the weather, the kids, those kinds of things. And you can use that to build rapport with your limited English proficient client, just the way you would with an English speaking client. Next slide. So I mentioned that vital documents are the documents that are subject to translation. And those are the documents that are critical to accessing federally assisted activities, in this case, affordable housing. And the thing that you also need to understand is untranslated vital documents must always be interpreted if they have not been, because they have not been translated. And there's no safe harbor on that. Next slide. So some of the vital documents that are worth just kind of touching on here: your marketing information, of course, because that has to do with access to your housing, or those documents would be considered vital documents. But I also want you to remember that that could include information on your website. And because oftentimes you have project information there, sometimes housing providers have the application or even their tenant selection criteria there. Certainly a fair housing poster and non-discrimination posters would be vital documents and should be available in those languages that the language needs assessment says that they should be in on your property. A building system shutdown, from a maintenance standpoint, from a building system shutdown could be a vital document. So you need to think broadly about what a vital document is. Certainly, one of the trouble areas in vital documents is income recertification notices. You do not want that person to toss that notice in the garbage and then somehow not recertify, or not know that they're to recertify. There's many more vital documents, but those would all be listed in the language access plan. Next slide. Now, we talked about language access tools that you can clarify in the language access plan. So here are some of them. We talked about some of these already, but a language identification poster. Sometimes these are available from those telephonic language interpretation vendors. We'll talk a little bit about what those are too, but like Language Line provides a poster, but there are also I Speak cards that you can download from lep.gov, and that's one of the resource links in the chat box. We talked about the written offer to interpret. That's a tool, and again, it's available in many languages on the Intermountain Fair Housing Council's language access guide. The Department of Justice publishes a Know Your Rights pamphlet. So that can be one source for to help people understand their language access rights. It's specifically designed for limited English proficient persons. One of the most important tools, and there are many, but telephonic language interpretation vendors. You may know what that is by if I say Language Line. Language Line is one of the many vendors that's out there. The importance of a telephonic language interpretation vendor and having that available on site for your property manager is they provide languages interpretation in over 200 languages, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And even if that property manager has never had a non-English speaker non-English speaker, limited English proficient person approach them before, that when it does happen, they can help them in almost any language that they would need through this telephonic language interpretation vendor. There's also a couple of pamphlets called, let's see, Please Repair and Welcome to Your New Home. They're translated. They're available on Intermountain Fair Housing Council's Language Access Guide. And the intention there is they're translated into several languages. It allows a limited English proficient person to literally point to a picture and identify a repair need. So it might save you from having to pay an interpreter to help that LEP person describe their repair need that they have. So it can be a cost-saving mechanism, and it's free. You can download and print it as you need it. Dual handset phone, and there's a picture of one there. I think that this is really great tool to have, and I ask my clients to look at this, and I hope that you will too. The importance of it is that typically, especially when we're using a telephonic language interpretation vendor, we're using our speakerphone. And what happens is that broadcasts your conversation to everybody in the lobby, and what should be maybe a confidential conversation that you're having certainly becomes public. So the dual handset phone allows you to speak with that interpreter. You're on a handset, your client's on a handset, and it keeps that conversation more private. The other thing that I like about it has a volume control on it. So if the client is hearing impaired in some way, they can adjust the volume on the handset. So next slide. How are we doing on time, Erik? Are we good?
We're doing great. We've got another half hour, close to a half hour.
Well, we're pretty close to done. So the unwritten rule that we talked about, and if you just attended David Penny's and Eric Stephen, their presentations, they talked about document. It's really important to document what goes on, and it's no different when we're talking about language assistance. So some things that you want to document, maybe from a customer service standpoint, is maintaining in the file what a person's language assistance needs are, which language that they speak, so that you can, before that person ever arrives there, you can schedule an interpreter, or you can have that interpreter already on the line when that person arrives, if it's a telephonic interpreter. But at least you know what that person's language is right away. You don't have to go through identifying them. And also that information becomes institutionalized in the sense that when one property manager leaves and the next one comes in, they can quickly find that information. Now, there's some rules against that in Massachusetts. So if anybody is on here from Massachusetts, you would probably not want to do that based on some state law there.
Gary, this is Erik. I want to jump in and offer
Sure.
another option depending on what your capacity is. We've actually created something called an LEP contact tracker tool. That's an online tool on our intranet just within IHFA. And so anytime somebody has a contact either in person or over the phone or email with somebody that needs interpretive services or things translated, we log that, and it has a time and date stamp and who interacted with the customer, what language was involved to the best of our ability, and how they address the language need. And so that's another option, just to kind of increase your ability to document things and keep them kind of organized.
That is a really great idea, Erik. And one of the things that trying to put these digital tools to work for us to do this, as opposed to paper and pen, I think is really important. Actually, the next thing I was going to mention was something like that. I think it's also important to track when you have these interchanges, just even keeping track of the time, the duration of that interpretation. whether it's an in-person interpreter or a telephonic interpreter. That way you can check the bill that you get. So sometimes billings are not accurate and they do not reflect that interpreter's work. So that's important. And lastly, I think whenever there's a friction involved or a controversy of some kind, you definitely want to document. You want to be sure that you have the interpreter's name or number, and they all have an identification number, the ones, the telephonic interpreters. So that you can, if a complaint arises from this transaction that you have the information available. Next slide. Okay, we were going, just touching a little bit on affirmative fair housing marketing and limited English proficiency. We know the language access plan identifies languages in the market and whether they're hitting thresholds or not. But your affirmative fair housing marketing plan is really not, is directed at harmonizing ethnic and racial demographics and some other things, harmonizing those things with your market area. So your fair housing plan may identify that you should have perhaps more Asian Pacific Islanders as tenants in your property. What the language access plan can do for you sometimes is identify the languages that are in the market that you might want to put your marketing materials in, and then also help you identify perhaps places where that marketing information should be placed. So one informs the other, and they work together in a way sometimes, and they can be helpful for somebody that's trying to figure out what they want to do or need to do to comply with their own affirmative fair housing marketing plan. Next slide.
And Gary, I think another kind of key thing that you kind of brought up a while ago is get to know what your local resources are. And I think maybe Rob Christensen emphasized this early on. You know, find out who your local resources are that can help with, you know, interpretation or translation of documents. Get to know them before you need them, before you need to access them, and develop a relationship. Like, you can reach out to you if you're in a university town. There might be an Office of Diversity and Inclusion in the college or university. You know, those are good resources sometimes. Different organizations that maybe speak a common language, you know, that's not English. You know, get to know them. But lots of good opportunities to kind of add to your toolbox.
Yeah, that's really important, Erik. What you mentioned there. It's I typically don't emphasize that in my training, but that is really important, and for exact reasons that you suggested. There are oftentimes sometimes no cost or low cost language access resources right in our own community. One of them in our community here in Boise is the Boise Interpreters, and that's one of the resources that's listed at the top of the chat box over there and that you have access to. Also, if you happen to be an interpreter and on this, that's a place to sign up and a place where people can find you and your services. So we actually skipped number 7, Erik.
Oh, we don't want to skip that.
Well, let's see, maybe the slide is missing. Well, that's okay.
Oh, you know, the slide might be missing.
Yeah, for some reason that slide is missing.
I think number 6 was the most important language access tool. I'm trying to remember what that last one was.
And so the people that are on this presentation here that are either with property management companies or property managers themselves, you know, they're on site struggling through what they have to do every day. You're the person out there that is going to be deciding what kind of language access program that you have in place. You're the one that's deciding how and when you're going to implement that language access plan that you've developed. You're the one that really determines when that limited English proficient person, you have that encounter with them, whether it turns out to be a good experience for them or a bad experience. And if it turns out to be a bad experience, that could end up later as a bad experience for you through a complaint process of some kind. So as it turns out, you are the person, you're the most important tool. You're the person that's going to be determining whether that person has that good customer service experience in any language when they encounter you on your property. So I think the next thing is Q&A, Eric, if we have any.
Do you want to, should we launch our quick poll?
Oh, sure.
We got a really quick poll here. We're going to just spend a few seconds on this. So this is a multiple choice. You want to choose all that apply on this one. So go ahead, if you can see that, start selecting those options, the ones that you think are the best options for an interpreter in a housing transaction. We're going to take about another 10 seconds on this.
I answered them, Eric. I hope I'm right.
I hope you're right too. Yeah, there's a lot riding on that, Gary. No, these are actually anonymous. So.
Oh, that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, probably a good thing. Yeah, I think so. All right, so we're coming on down to the wire here. Okay, and polling. So, sharing the results here. It looks like, and can you see that? Can you see the results on it, Gary?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, fantastic. So it looks like Language Line is up there, and again, Language Line is really a stand-in for like a professional third-party interpretive or translation service. There, like Gary said, there are multiple different contractors or vendors for that. So whichever one you land on is kind of, that's the stand-in for that. Certified interpreter, we got 78% there. Fluent bilingual housing staff, if you've got them, they're a great asset. 65% online translation, 15%. And I think, you kind of talked a little bit about the, where to use those and where not to use those. Use them for non-vital documents, non-vital, kind of just, conversations where it's not going to impact either the access of a resource, the loss of a resource, or the renegotiation of a resource, involving housing. Child of a tenant or client, okay, good, 3%, only 3%. We'd like to see that at 0, but you mentioned some of the reasons why not to involve children in translation and interpretation. Another one was brought up in another training I attended, and that is if you've got a complaint involving kids vandalizing,
Yes.
property, and you have those kids interpreting for their parents when the parents are needing to hear about it. That's probably not a good use of kids as interpreters. So
those are all great examples, Eric, of
an
explanation of each one of those. And
so
thanks for that. That's good.
And I think we at IHFA, we've used Language Line off and on. We use it now, and we've tried another one. It just wasn't quite as good, so we've gone back to that one. But it is nice to be able to just pick up the phone, and I think I haven't had to use it much. Other employees have used it more regularly in our branch offices dealing with rental assistance programs. But I think I've used it with a person who spoke Thai, several years ago. They did a great job. And as far as the machine translation or online translation, one thing to kind of keep in mind, which goes back to Gary's description of plain language or plain English, anytime you've got vital documents that are part of your marketing or outreach materials, really think about plain language in those, because if you're trying to translate something from English to, say, Thai or Vietnamese or, Russian or whatever the language is, the simpler the language used, the easier it is to get those concepts across. Not all languages use subject verb object structures. If you're speaking German, you have to be really patient because the main verb comes at the end of the sentence. Just takes a long time to figure out what's going on. But keep that in mind. Plain language is, again, it's like customer service. It's welcome in any language. So let's see, Gary, what do you want to do next? You want to see if we've got questions?
Yeah, let's see if there are any questions, Erik, in a chat box.
Okay. When receiving an initial phone call from an LEP person, what is the best way to determine what language they speak? Oh, that's a great question.
Well,
I've got some ideas, and then I'll
sure, go ahead, Erik.
So, at IHFA, I created something that I just call a customer service document, and it addresses both LEP and disability and accommodation. And so in the language piece, I just kind of phonetically describe, several different languages that are sort of high frequency languages in this market. And then I use a phonetic kind of pronunciation guide for each one. And, so that you can sort of see if somebody, a lot of people will know simple words in English, not everyone, obviously, but, if they hear their language, they're going to say yes or no. You kind of get an idea of what's going on there. That helps you if you're going to follow up with Language Line or another interpretive service or translation service to know like what you need to do in order to reach this person and communicate. So I think, I've put a link to this, like the CIA has a world kind of language, kind of page as well. It talks about the different languages spoken. Just get to know maybe if you're in an area that's a resettlement community, and you can reach out to the refugee resettlement agencies locally, find out from them, what are the most common languages that are spoken aside from, say, English and Spanish, and then get to know like what those languages sound like if you can. If you're the LEP coordinator or the designated person for that, it really pays off to spend a little bit of time just listening to that language, and find some movies that are in that language and that have subtitles, and get used to them. It helps. You got to train your ear a little bit.
Yeah. One other option that I can think of there is sometimes a person doesn't always speak a pure version of a language. That's some of the Eastern European languages for sure is that's true of. And so one of the things you can do if you have one of those telephonic language interpretation vendors at your beck and call, you can call them up and they can be on that listening in and help you determine what that language is, because their ear is more attuned to that than ours is.
Right.
Yeah.
We have another question, Gary. Is somebody that sounds like maybe somebody who's not publicly funded or doesn't have any publicly assisted units. So it's more private housing. They say, how is it our responsibility to translate or provide interpreter at our cost when we're not funded or have received public assistance housing due to financial hardship? So maybe if they lack the capacity, the financial capacity, to do that, or they're not receiving any public subsidies. So, and he or she adds, we're not the CIA or FBI.
Well, in fact, the questioner is exactly right. If they are not federally assisted, they do not have to provide language assistance at their costs, according to the HUD LEP guidance. And that person can read a little bit more about that if they go to the Intermountain Fair Housing Council, the Language Access Guide, and they want to look under Title 6 or Title 8, which is just fair housing, which would apply to you. And it talks exactly about that and gives you some guidance. But on the other hand, if there's low or no cost interpretation available in the community, it's to deny a person that. And you may, I mean, in this market right now, we're not struggling to find tenants or applicants for our units. But sometimes when a market is tough, you may want to offer that interpretation just to help people find their way to your project and your unit that you want to have occupied. The only other thing that I can think about that, say about that is to be a little careful if you're talking about an environment where a person might be evicted. There may be some consumer laws that would affect what you do and what would be in your own best interest in terms of providing interpretation. So if you get in an adverse position with a tenant, that's something to at least consider and maybe even ask your own attorney about.
Agreed. And, I think this, what you're saying is sort of similar to the conversations I have with a lot of, builders and developers and architects, who are looking to create subdivisions or new single family construction. And that is the concept of visitability, meaning, creating minimally accessible, wheelchair accessible housing, not just multifamily housing, but also single family and townhomes and row housing and stuff. Because it's about a market, there's a market out there for your product, which is housing. And, if you want to reach the widest market, then you do your market research and find out who's in that area, who's going to be looking and be ready to meet the needs that they have and provide, good customer service.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've talked to a lot of site managers over the years. I run the housing hotline for IHFA and started that in 1998. And over the years, I've heard from a lot of site managers that have, kind of pretty good populations of folks that are refugees from other countries that have made Boise their home. And they're all really happy to, have these kind of really diverse communities in their properties. And so it's been a net positive for them. And so they know that it's in their interest to, kind of understand how they can communicate and, and interact.
Yeah.
So
one other thought I have.
Go ahead.
Yeah, one other thought I have, Erik, is that we mentioned Google Translate, and you should restrain your use of that in a Title VI of federally assisted housing environment. But there's no such restriction on that in non-assisted housing. That's a tool. And again, it's complicated. It won't always give you accurate conversion of one language into another language, but it's a place to start for somebody. And instead of turning them away, you can always pull out your smartphone and queue up Google Translate and try to have a conversation. I think that is kind of a customer service thing, a measure that you can take as a non-assisted housing provider. It's not perfect, but as opposed to doing nothing, I think it's a better option.
Yeah, I think showing that you're kind of operating with some due diligence to kind of reach across that barrier can be really positive. I've used Google Translate on my iPhone when I was traveling in the Netherlands, and you can actually hold the camera up if you're trying to read, on a grocery shelf, you can actually show the camera that product, and it'll translate that, or street signs, things like that. It's pretty amazing.
Yes,
but if you want to have a little bit of fun, there's some entertainment value here. Also very educational. Try taking a simple, fairly simple sentence, translate that into Thai, and then translate it from Thai to German or some other European language, then translate it to, Tagalog, which is in the Philippines or something, then translate it back to English. It's like a game of telephone on steroids. It's pretty amusing. Then you can kind of see why those machine translation devices are a little, they're not quite there yet.
Yeah. Yes.
So it says, so somebody's agreeing with you, saying, just as Gary said, there are many local resources to be free to utilize. We should all do our best for the LEP applicant residents. Thank you, Debbie. If you use Google Translate and translate text into another language, always retranslate it back into English to see what it says. Yeah, amen. It helps if you need to rework the words you use. Yeah, exactly. That goes back to plain language. Anytime you can just get that language pared down to the basics, what's the essential message in that sentence that you need to convey, and try to keep your prepositions down to a minimum. If you're translating English into Spanish, those of you who've done this may know that you need to plan on adding about 10 to 15% to your overall, the space you're going to take up on a page. And so there's some things to consider when you're writing your original document that can make a difference in the long run.
A good analogy to that is that, again, we use terms of art in this business, and we assume everybody knows what they mean. Think of it as a doctor explaining to a refugee that doesn't speak English that they have pancreatic cancer. And that person doesn't even know what a pancreas is, let alone what the implications of having cancer of the pancreas might be for them. And so while that might be a relatively short few words that would have an impact on you and I, for that refugee, that non-English speaking person, it may not register what is going on. And so thankfully, we're not dealing with those kinds of life and death situations most of the time. It gives you an idea of sometimes it takes more words to explain, and sometimes you have to give an interpreter a little bit more time, slow down your conversation so that the interpreter has time to do that. And also, as I mentioned, if you have an opportunity to brief the interpreter beforehand about the terminology that you're going to use.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's one that says, unfortunately, we speak multiple languages, tried our best to accommodate tenants from various backgrounds. However, the Refugee Center in Twin Falls employs folks who are not proficient in the language they claim to translate themselves, and then the burden falls on us. So, I think, Gary, you mentioned some diversity within a larger language group, of say dialects or other things where you may have some differences. The other thing I know is that for some folks coming from certain conflict areas, there may be some issues with trust between your customer and whoever's doing the interpreting, depending on which group they're affiliated with in the home country. That's another thing to be sensitive about.
Yeah, sometimes I know of two instances where the interpreter, which in both cases happened to be a telephonic language interpretation service from a vendor, the interpretation was specifically done in a way that disadvantaged the client. Right. And it was because of these differences from back in the homeland. Right. And so, yeah, that can happen. And as a housing provider, you're probably not going to know that until you may get a complaint. and then you somehow have to unwind that and address it.
It's important to, it all goes back to your focus on documentation. Make sure that you document who you used for interpretation or translation, what was conveyed to you, and keep a record of that, so that if there is a dispute you have to unravel, then it's easier to kind of go back and pin down what the problem was. So I mean, for this questioner, I think again it's that documentation and then providing feedback to the agency, or maybe reach out to one of the other sister agencies in Boise, the Boise area, for instance, and see if you can find an alternate person to kind of double check that and kind of confirm what's being said.
Yeah, and the questioner was correct about I think they said that they interpretation wasn't available, or the local source wasn't willing to provide it, or whatever the reason.
They weren't proficient. They
weren't
in the language they claimed to
Yeah.
be proficient in. Yeah.
And then the responsibility does fall back on the housing provider. It's always the housing provider's responsibility in a federally assisted housing setting to provide that language assistance.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I spent some time studying Mandarin, 可是我说的不好, which means I don't speak well. I can say certain phrases and I can understand certain things, but boy, I'd never be qualified to interpret for anybody.
Mhm.
Same with French or Spanish or any of the other languages I've studied. But yeah, it takes a lot of constant use and to become really, really fluent. And I think your point earlier of that qualification versus certification, you know, if you're dealing with legal, like lease documents, or, you know, again, vital documents that can mean the difference between getting housing and losing housing. You want somebody who really knows their stuff, who knows the industry language.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're lucky enough to have that, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, we're at our time. I'm flexible. Gary, I think you're flexible. If anybody has any final questions and want to put them in the chat, we'd be happy to respond to those.
Absolutely, yeah. But thank you for everybody, I think, for attending. I hope you found this helpful and useful. Erik and I enjoy doing this kind of stuff, and we work on this stuff pretty hard and try to do the right thing, and hopefully you benefited from it. So anyway, thank you for being here today.
And I'll share one other thing. I'm on the board of the Idaho Rural Partnership, and we've been, since 2000, we've been doing something called a community review. And we started doing something called a listening session in these communities around the state. And we started doing a Spanish language listening session early on in Glens Ferry, and then we've done several, you know, like English and Spanish language sessions. And what I found is, you know, you have these sizable populations in a community like Glens Ferry or Hammett or, you know, Aberdeen, for instance. But because of a language barrier, a lot of times folks are left out of civic projects or volunteer projects and community activities. And what we heard from the Spanish-speaking populations in those communities is, you know, we want to volunteer our time. We want to be engaged. We want to help create a clean community with, you know, housing, safe neighborhoods, you know, good schools for our kids, good recreational opportunities. And some of us have our own backhoes. You know, we can come in and help do the heavy lifting. But they just typically don't get invited because of the language barriers. So I think the bottom line is when you can bridge those sort of kind of superficial boundaries, there's a lot to gain. And so beyond, you know, just sort of complying with a federal law, for instance, it can be a really enriching, opportunity, I think.
Good point. I think that's the point of your that good customer service in any language.
Yeah. So it makes people feel welcome. And thanks for all the kind words, you guys. Lots of great comments in the chat. We really appreciate you, and particularly when I refer people out around the state to housing providers, I always count on having nice people on the other end of that referral, and that means you guys. So thanks for all the work you do.
Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Appreciate your time and expertise on this. We'll continue the conversation.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, I think my phone number was on my slide there. Feel free to give me a call. I'm happy to.
Yeah. And I should have the video of this uploaded by the end of the day today. So check that page at fairhousingforum.org. Y'all take care.
Thank you, Erik.
Okay. Ciao.